Hi, everyone. I hope you all are doing lovely on this beautiful November evening. I just feel like very quiet fire voice. That's what it sounds like. Okay. My name is Julia Scott, and I am really excited about tonight's panel, especially considering our current social political landscape and how that's all operating and how it's all impacting us. So I want to welcome you to, this is actually a part two of our political discussion. I'm first going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to start getting into some questions. Because we have like a small group tonight, I'm really excited. I think it will be a nice, intimate conversation. So we have some questions, but also please feel free if you're like, hey, I have a question or I have some thoughts. I think this works really well, obviously, if we have participation from our audience. So sit back, get some tea, some cookies, and let's talk politics. All right, so I'm going to have our panelists introduce ourselves, and I'm going to have Dottye go first.
My name's Dottye Burt Markowitz. I, over 20 years ago, was among the group of people that actually formed Baltimore Racial Justice Action. It was just sort of people all doing some kind of anti-racism work at the time. And we didn't know where it was going to go, and it took a few years before that sort of settled down, where we really spent a lot of time building community. And I think that has a lot to do with how successful BRJA has been in doing the work that they've done for over 20 years now. So I was in that group and very proud of that. So was my husband, Stan Markowitz. And I still terribly miss three of the co-founders who all died in 2020. So I always feel the missing of those folks, and yet also feel their spirits here. So.
My name is Andy Ellis. I first interacted with BRJA in 2008. I was coaching debate at Towson University at the time, and I had the opportunity to take the class for white folks then, and it was really useful for me. It helped me to develop praxis, helped me to develop theory around the work that we were doing at Towson at the time. I've coached debate. I've been involved in grassroots politics here in the city. I'm currently running for governor as a Green Party candidate. It's not a campaign appearance tonight, but I do feel like it's important to tell folks that because it does situate a lot of what I have to say. And I'm excited to be on this panel. We did this a year ago, and it was like 7 days after the 2024 election. And I think it's really useful to revisit the things we thought at the time and what has changed, what's still the same, and what direction we're going in. So I'm excited to pick this back up where we left it off a year ago.
Good evening. My name is Lawrence Grandpre. I'm Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We go by our initials LBS. We're a grassroots think tank that works on a variety of issues related to advocating for political issues related to social justice, police accountability, getting money to grassroots organizations. So I was on the panel last year and look forward to, sharing insights and perspectives from, someone born and raised here in Baltimore, largely on the West Side, where we are right now. So.
Awesome. Yes. So as Andy mentioned, we did a very similar event last year after the election. I think that a lot of people were just kind of looking for like, well, what do we do? Right? Like the administration had not taken office yet. What happened? Why did it happen? What can we do? And now we're almost, it does not feel like it, but we're almost a year in. It feels like 10 years, yes. But yes, we're almost a year in, and a lot has happened since. So I think, obviously I want to start with one of the more recent elections that we saw last week. So what I wanted to ask the panelists, what are your reactions to Tuesday's election? And what do you think it means going forward? Because there was so much discussion now, like, well, this was a mandate. This is kind of rebuking, what the Republican and the MAGA movement has been saying. Voters are saying this now. But is that actually true? So I want to get from the panelists, what do you all think? Andy, you got the mic first, so.
I don't think there's a particularly clear or coherent mandate that came out of that election last Tuesday. I think it was a rebuke of some of the ways that Republicans and the Trump administration have been pushing things, but I almost think that the worst case scenario would have been Democrats lose in New Jersey, Democrats lose in Virginia, redistricting in California doesn't happen, and Mamdani loses in New York to Cuomo, right? But most of those things weren't going to happen, right? Like if you look at what was happening in that election leading up to it, while the horse race and the news coverage of Virginia and New Jersey made it seem like it was close, neither of those were actually going to be that close in this case. And so I think it was a confirmation that the Democratic Party has not lost all of its ability to resist, but it was not a confirmation that there is a new and resurgent and strong Democratic Party that is ready to take on the challenge of 21st century American Trump fascism, right? Like it was not that. It was, the wheels didn't fall off that bus entirely last Tuesday. But I don't think that it necessarily puts the Democrats in a particularly strong position to stand up for social justice, to stand up for racial justice, or to stand up for really any justice of any sort. I think you have, two sort of military industrial complex aligned Democrats winning in New Jersey and Virginia. You have a redistricting vote in California that should have passed. If it didn't pass, it would have been a real problem for politics in California. And the Democrat who won the Democratic nomination out of the primary in New York won against a disgraced sexual predator who had not just done that, but had stripped a lot of value out of New York City, had punished Black communities and immigrant communities in New York City. So it's like, I look at the 2025 election and say, none of that is surprising to me. And it is a confirmation that the Democratic Party still exists and functions, but not that it is ready to be a strong force of resistance or justice.
Well, ditto to everything Andy said. I think what I would add in terms of my own reaction to the whole scene is that I do think it was a reflection of the mass, increasingly more powerful and more in numbers of the three, big demonstrations that happened over the course of the year, as well as, and I think most people don't think about this aspect of it. It wasn't just those 7 million people in the last ones and et cetera, but it was all the people they had conversations with in the course of deciding whether they were going to go to those events or not. And that's what I felt most that day, was not so much about what does this mean for the Democrats, but what does it mean for more people becoming engaged and making a difference that they can make.
Yeah, I largely agree with what's been said. I think that for people just trying to make sense of this, it's important to understand. So every 2 years, obviously, all the people that are in Congress, in the House, are up for a vote. So those are the midterm elections, every 4 years presidency. So this is the off-year elections. Next year is the mid-year. Then we'll have another off-year. Then we'll have a presidential cycle. Of every one of those electorates at a national level is different demographically. So an off-year cycle results can only tell you so much about a midterm result and only tell you so much about a presidential result. Trump's voters are largely low propensity voters. They tend to show up only in presidential years. So it doesn't really tell us much about what a likely presidential outcome would be. Also doesn't tell us a lot what the midterm will be. The Republicans are talking about redistricting in a way that means the Democrats will have to have a 5 or 6 point popular vote win just to win back the House. They're only up 3 to 6 points in most polls in terms of a generic ballot right now. So in the face of genuine overt, attempted, performative, but still largely overt fascism, Democrats only beat Republicans from 3 to 6%. Democrats won everything last week, and that should be incredibly concerning. There is not a mandate for overt performative fascism, but there's not a mandate for it, you know. And off-year cycle elections don't really tell me much about like why is that the case.
Mhm.
And I think that's the case in part because a bunch of reasons, but these results are not a mandate against that because of the way they were produced. So even Mamdani has to moderate. His people are, you know, essentially talking about, well, Adams won because of the backlash to Black Lives Matter. And you could say it's because people were racist, but it's also an unspoken or sometimes spoken argument that, oh, we overreached. We became too woke. We became too progressive on criminal justice. Some of that is we were too performative in how we talked about it. I agree with that to some extent, but there is, and this is again from Mamdani's people, the so-called hard left saying this. Adams won because of Black Lives Matter backlash. Basically, we became too woke and not enough focused on material issues. So that's a trade-off between some of the so-called racial justice stuff and material issues. Similarly, and some would say this is a good thing to wrap up, some of the folks like Mikey Sherrill in North New Jersey, though they are moderates, took a more progressive tone in some of their conversation. So even she talked about she's going to declare an affordability emergency for energy. I have no idea what that means from someone who used to be in the CIA. So people are claiming that this is a new progressive wave, but there's nothing about this progressivism that's inclusive of a redistribution of power or wealth to working class people or Black or brown people. Now, I've jokingly called it like a spook socialism. You know, spooks are people that work for the intelligence agencies. And you can have a version of economic redistribution of the benefits of empire without actually engaging the racialized violence of empire. And I think a lot of people on the so-called left will be fine with that. And I think that's part of the concerning, frightening thing about the results. So we have Spanberger, who's also formerly intelligence, and Sherrill, but also the general leftism that still wants to claim to be anti-woke in a way that can be used to basically say we have to start talking about racism because that turns off moderate white voters or progressive populist white voters in a way that can be entirely inclusive of some of the limited economic distribution of capitalism without challenging capital or capitalism, but trying to smooth off the rough edges in ways that make it more electorally appealing to the type of people that showed up last week, which I think are largely a lot of the no kings voters, but not representative of the people of America or the agenda we need to actually fight fascism.
Well, that was a lot of information. I think that, yeah, I think one of the things that I have struggled with, and just like watching the news and kind of just like reading and just like based off what you all are saying, is that there's a lot of like performance happening. So there's a lot of the language that is used, maybe in anti-racist spaces, or more progressive languages used, but the policies themselves aren't actually representative of the language that is like being purported, right? So it's kind of like when you have a lot more people going to therapy, and so people are using therapy language, but they're not actually like understanding like that's not what that means. So and I think that does a lot for kind of keeps the same engine running. And you can see that I think even the way this is being discussed in the news. But one of the things that I really think is important, and I think this is, was really important even after for our last event, is people I think also want to know like how do they get involved? I think what you said, Dottye, is like, what does this all mean and how do people on the ground, not so much about Republican or Democrat, right? But how do regular everyday people actually get involved in this work, and making sure that their communities are safe, that their families are safe. So as we're kind of talking this evening, I want to make sure we're thinking about what role, local and grassroots organizations can play in like building and sustaining momentum after the election, but also just like I think as we are going forward to build communities that are, helping each other, that are healthy, and that can take care of each other, honestly, no matter who is in office. So I'll ask, one of the biggest things I think with Mamdani's election and his campaign is like there was this kind of energy that you saw, I think, especially with like young people. And I know, Andy, you've talked a lot about the fact that, like, of course, in New York, that it's really awesome because I mean, I watched it, obviously, but New York has some structural kind of like things that are set up that allows it to kind of happen. Can you share, I guess, like more on how maybe that can be translated, or could that be translated in like a local election, like in Baltimore or in other areas?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the important things about the Mamdani campaign is that he used public financing and matching funds both in the primary and in the general election. It's a system that has been set up in New York in order to ensure that candidates that don't take dollars from big donors can have access to the elections, can be on television, can have the resources they need. We have a public financing program in Maryland at the gubernatorial level and in 6 counties. And I think that it is absolutely a vehicle that should be used by anybody who can manage to use it. So the governor's race has it. Our campaign is participating in it. Baltimore County, Baltimore City, Anne Arundel County, Howard County, Prince George's County, and Montgomery County all have a form of public financing that is available in the primary and in the general election. And so I think that grassroots and insurgent candidates should absolutely get into that program because it is 4, 5, 6 times match of whatever they raise. And it is usually paid for by fines and fees from people who are bad at doing the elections. They're breaking the law, or they're making mistakes and things like that. So, I mean, there's a part of me that really thinks that when this campaign is done, or maybe during this campaign, I'm going to set up a group of folks that can go find all the campaign finance violations of the well-paid Democrats and Republicans and just become a pest to them and use that in order to fund public financing funds and things like that so that more candidates can use that type of vehicle. The other thing I think is that New York has ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting in the primary allowed Mamdani to craft a different type of coalitional politics with Lander and with some of the other folks than would have existed if it was a single member choice. Now, that didn't happen in the general election, and I actually think some of the more conservatives or more of the capitalist folks wish it had happened in the general election because I think it would have worked out well for them. I don't actually think it would have, but I think those 2 structural innovations help to make Mamdani's victory possible. Right now, he is a very talented politician, and he probably would have been able to succeed without those structural advantages. But those structural advantages, I think, helped him to go to take that talent and go from 1% in the polls to winning. And in Maryland, there's ranked choice voting in Tacoma Park. There's ranked choice voting in Greenbelt. Greenbelt passed ranked choice voting this week. And there's, I think, a good move here in Maryland in order to start to do it at the municipal level. A lot of times people will say to us as Greens, you should stop focusing on elections and start focusing on getting ranked choice voting everywhere. And I think that's an interesting idea, but in Maryland, if you want electoral reform, it's going to have to come through Democrats in the General Assembly because it's going to require amending the Constitution, and they have a monopoly on amending the Constitution in the state of Maryland since they ended Reconstruction with the current Constitution that they passed in 1867. So I think that the pathway to electoral reforms is not come from outsiders. The pathway to electoral reforms comes from making the people who are in the position to make the decision understand that there's consequences if they don't engage in electoral reform. And that consequence means losing, right? Like that's what consequences mean in electoral terms. It means you no longer have that seat and somebody else is in it and is going to make a different decision. So I think we can look and say some of those structural reforms help to make that more possible, and recognize also Mamdani is a very talented politician who tapped into a moment in time and had a set of opponents that made this election very possible.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Anybody?
Yeah, so I think partially it's going to be materially improving people's conditions and tying the work of doing what needs to happen for our communities to survive to having people who plug into that work see a larger political vision so they can see how things happen politically impact their ability to survive materially. So just, I mean, some examples I think I may have brought up last year, like with the food stamps being cut with the shutdown. During 2020, we actually gave millions of dollars to food banks. And they're very dependent upon donations and federal funds. So when Trump cut that money, now the food banks are suffering. And at the time, we mentioned like people are food insecure. But the investments we make in things like food bank, a nonprofit charity model, What if we instead focused on things like urban farming, growing food, food sovereignty? If we had done that 5 years ago with those millions of dollars of pandemic money, we'd be so much better off for this moment we are right now. And what happens is that politicians of both parties use our need to survive and basically take us politically hostage, whereby to meet people's needs, we have to forestall the investment in the infrastructure needed to actually eliminate the dependency that they depend on. Right. So I think part of what has to happen is folks doing the material work of food, meaning needs for food security, need to link up to policies that support things like food sovereignty, like supporting urban farming, supporting investments in institutions that do things like that. And if they don't follow through, there needs to be a threat of something like a Green Party to hold them accountable when they continue to use our suffering as their political football. An example I know I used last year, like people need jobs. People economically are suffering. And we need to diversify our economy away from depending upon Washington, is what Democratic Party folks in Maryland have said. When they say that, they may things like cybersecurity, including like Israeli firms, and data centers. Like that's what they mean. And we need to offer a clear, compelling alternative, because otherwise you see in PG County, they're so desperate for revenue, government revenue. They're like, yeah, I get environmental racism, but we need the tax dollars. So put them here, rather have them here than somewhere else. So it's like an example I gave last year is like, we need school uniforms, right? Right now, they're largely produced in India. We now have I think we now have a tariff on India, right? So there's actually be a great opportunity to produce these things here in the state of Maryland, in Baltimore. There's an institution on North Avenue in West Baltimore called the Image Center that's been trying to get support so that they can actually hire people from community to make school uniforms. And what if there was an investment in something like that to meet a clear material need in a way that actually centered manufacturing capacity in those jobs here in the city of Baltimore? And these are the sort of possibilities that get obscured because of the inability to tie these abstract political concepts to concrete material conditions locally. So I think that's an example of something that can energize people, that get them to care. And also, to the extent they don't deliver, can actually energize people to become radicalized and be interested in third-party politics, or just generally holding people accountable, because these corporate Democrats are going to continue to use our suffering as a political tool, and that creates incredible demobilization and frustration. So we have to turn that demobilization and frustration into people envisioning a better life they can clearly see.
All right. Okay. So here's the thing. So there were some other questions I was going to ask, but I feel like the third party conversation is like already here.
Can I
Go-
say a thing about the
Oh.
data center point that Lawrence
Yeah.
was making really quickly? So last night on our podcast, we had a woman, Taylor Fraser McCollum, who is helping to lead the fight against the Landover data center, and is, helping to mobilize people in her community to show up at local discussions, local government meetings and things like that, and fight. They managed to get a 6-month moratorium on new data centers in Prince George's County, which is a win, because right now the state has given blanket authority to counties and businesses to make these deals. But I think that example is really valuable to the point that Lawrence was making about investing in the kind of institutions that can be different. Taylor was very adamant to say that she is not anti-technology, not even anti-data center, perhaps, but anti-data center when it is for trillion-dollar mega corporations that are going to use our data in order to make profit for their shareholders and then sell that data to the government so they can surveil us as we engage in resistance. I'm anti that, right? And so, like, everybody should be anti that. And I think when we're talking about these things, we need to identify who the villain is and who the bad actor is. And in this case, it is the corporations and the governments that work with those corporations in order to exploit people in order to make profit. That's who the villain is in this case. And so just like we could have a place here in the city that is making school uniforms for people, we could have a sustainable data center in Baltimore that is cooperatively run and helps people who are interested in technology careers to have access to the kind of servers they need in order to build the tools. There's plenty of people around here who could be great at building apps and tools and things like that. But if we can get them free of having to use Amazon as their infrastructure and pay Jeff Bezos so that he can become the next trillionaire, then we might be able to start to create the kind of institutions we need in order to survive in the 21st century economy. So I think that it's important when we talk about this to say, like, it is not the manufacturing of clothing that is bad, nor is it the housing of servers in a building that is bad. It is the corporations that are using their power in order to manipulate governments in order to enrich themselves at the expense of everybody else.
All right. Yeah. Also, what is your podcast?
My podcast is YouTube at Go Green 2026.
There you go. All right. So yeah, so all of that I think paints a really interesting picture about like one of the things that we're in is that we have a two-party system. And so I think because of that, I mean, I can speak from my own experience. I know growing up, I grew up in a Black middle class Baltimore family. And my family, my mom and my dad told me when I was younger, like we are Democrats and that's what you vote, that's what you do. The other party is not good for you. And so we don't vote for them. And so obviously as you get older, I learned about like the differences in those parties and a lot of my ideals what usually I think fit into, at least what I thought at that point was like the Democratic Party. But a lot of my kind of ideals and my ideologies that I actually believe in and my values don't actually match. And so this is where we kind of start getting into like, well, what other parties are there? And how do we actually make a multi-party system? Obviously, I think that a lot of people, we just have to work with the systems that we have. We just work within the Democrat Republican structure, but that leaves out so much. And I think it forces actually, especially the Democrats, to kind of be like a big tent party that has a bunch of people who have a very, different ideals and ideas about how to get there. And then of course, people's voices are left out of that. So, we've talked about moving beyond these two parties. How could additional parties influence policy and the priorities and voter engagement that we're, especially I think in this space we're in right now?
You want to take it?
So one of the things that we need to talk about is many people, I think, have mythologies about how politics works, and those mythologies are then deployed against the concept of third parties. So in a 51% system, first across the poll, it's very difficult for a third party to get 51%. So it's like, what's the point? They're not going to win. You need to have a sophisticated political analysis to see first what is being offered is so inadequate in the face of, again, somewhat performative, but like literal fascism at this point. Yeah. And you need to be clear about the possibility and reality about structuring your political demand so that you are getting meaningful concessions with the threat of a third party. So just the example we use is Hogan defeating Anthony Brown in 2014. There are things the Democratic Party did because they had to appeal to the Black vote that did not show up for Anthony Brown. They thought that because he was Black and he was a Democrat, people would show up. And when they didn't, they then did things like did substantial voter reenfranchisement. They did some policing reform. They did the blueprint for Maryland schools. Largely despite Hogan, but also knowing they needed to demonstrate they had to deliver something for the Black community for them to turn up next election. So part of it is like they were not likely going to do many of those things without the threat of a loss. In that case, it was a Republican. But in the world we live in, like even the results of 2025, it's highly likely that some Democrats will say the Democratic base is riled up. They're going to show up no matter what. We don't have to do anything for them anymore. All we have to do is appeal to independents. And some of them, moderate now may look more like it. When you may need a more populist veneer to your policies to appeal to some of the independents now. But it's the same thing. Like the Democratic base is lockstep. They want everything, so we don't got to do nothing for them. If you don't have the threat of a third party, that's what they're going to do. So you need to have a vision of, again, concrete material deliverable demands that you can say, look, if you don't do this, as they did with, and again, maybe not perfect, but as some people did in Michigan with the trying to leverage the possibility of voting uncommitted in the face of the genocide in Gaza, right? Again, some of those folks are Democratic Party operatives and some of those folks went back to the Dems. but still the threat raised the issue in a way that they put leverage, right? And something like a Green Party that can substantively raise core issues around, you know, just to kind of maybe put a bow on it. We have Democrats in Maryland right now using the same exact rhetoric Trump was using to demonize Black youth in DC when they talk about Black youth here in Baltimore. They're out of control. They are breaking curfew. They are committing crimes. All the things that Trump used to justify the National Guard is what Democrats in Maryland used to justify charging youth as adults at a rate so disproportionate to national best practices that you can't really map Maryland's violation of federal laws because it would literally skew the data for everyone else on the map. They're literally off the chart. And that's the Democrats here because they feel the Black vote is taken for granted. They have nowhere to go. So you need to be able to say, like, you're not just going to not charge youth as adults. You're not going to automatically charge youth as adults. You need to end that automatic practice. You just need to not charge most of them as adults and actually deliver, because that's actually what the data says makes sense. And if we as a community can't have the possibility of holding the Democrats accountable when they literally copy Trump's talking points about our youth, then what is the point of the Democrats? Why are we sitting here over and over again facing the same violation of our human rights as Black people? Because again, the Democratic Party seems the only lifeboat. And I think in the world where the Republicans have become, you know, seconded to a version of right-wing conservative populist fascism, having meaningful leverage over the Democrats in this state is going to require a multi-party democracy. And I can let Andy explain the rest.
I guess I will go next, and then you want to go after that, or do you want to go now? Okay. So I think I had a really interesting conversation with Senator Sidnor last year at an event that we were doing with LBS about Question H, which was David Smith's attempt to try to hijack our city council that we beat. And it was a good victory. We can talk about what's happened since then as sort of the disappointment of those potential types of coalitions, because I haven't seen the kind of action that could have come out of that motivating this year as much, but maybe that's a different question. But anyway, Senator Sidnor caught me after the thing and he said, I wish you would stop talking about a two-party system because we have a multi-party system. You are here. And at first, that didn't quite register with me. But what I think my understanding of it is like American history and Maryland history has long had multiple parties in it. But what we have is a system that only allows two parties to be healthy. And so it is structured in a way that allows there to be multiple parties, but makes it nearly impossible for those parties to be healthy and thus to be effective. So when a party is not healthy, especially a third party, or in Maryland, the Republicans as well, oftentimes what their position boils down to is not using the power of that ballot line in order to change outcomes that make people's lives materially better, but simply using that ballot line to give people choices outside of what they would have had otherwise. And choices without material change is a very neoliberal concept that, you know, it's nice to have choices. It's better to have 3 people on the ballot than it is to have 1 person on the ballot. But if having those 3 people on the ballot doesn't do anything to change the material conditions of more youth being charged as adults than any other state in the country, or higher rental evictions of any state in the country, or any of the other things that are really bad in a state like Maryland that is dominated by Democrats and should be able to do these things, then those choices are not that important. So what we have to start thinking about is how do we use the power of multiple parties that exist right now in order to put leverage or to give communities that are fighting for their survival leverage over the politicians that get to make decisions about them. And in the short term, I think that's how we have to think about it. How do we use this as a means of power in order to give folks who feel like they're being neglected and who feel like their communities are being over-policed and who feel like their rent rates are too high and feel like the cost of living is too high and feel like the energy companies are getting subsidies while they're paying increasingly high rates? How do we give those folks the ability to use that threat of a vote outside of the two-party system power in order to change the outcomes? And so for me, as we start thinking about what a multi-party system looks like, I think the example that Lawrence gave is a really good one about Hogan being willing to make some concessions on criminal justice that weren't going to come otherwise. But that really happened in a two-party system. During the 2020 election in Baltimore City, Franca Mueller-Paz ran as a Green candidate against Robert Stokes in Council District 12. And Franca ran a great race. I think she got like 35% of the vote. She pressured the city to make a deal with Comcast at the time so that more students could have access to internet while they were at home during the pandemic. That happened as a result of her race. She was making this issue, she was knocking on doors, she was talking about it, and she made it so it was convenient and necessary for the mayor and the council to make that deal. She also helped to weaken Robert Stokes to the degree that Jermaine Jones, a much more progressive candidate than her or than him, could win in 2024. And I think if we start thinking about how we redefine the way that third parties can win outside of just simply looking at gaining and holding office, we can start to see avenues of power that change the dimensions of how things work. So one of the things that we're pushing very strongly on is the ability to get on the Maryland Public Television debate stage. Maryland Public Television has a set of editorial standards that only allow there to be two candidates that only allow the candidates of the two parties pretty much to be on the debate stage. They say that anybody could meet their threshold, but their threshold is 10% in polls, and no third-party candidate since 1868 has gotten more than 8% in polls. So they set it at a place that no one was ever going to get to. Part of the reason for that is because in 2006, Green Party candidate Kevin Zeese was on the debate stage in a United States Senate debate against Ben Cardin and Michael Steele, and he was talking about the Iraq War, he was talking about the war on drugs, he was talking about mass incarceration, and the Washington Post said Kevin Zeese, the Green Party candidate, won that debate. So after that, Maryland Public Television said, we are not doing that anymore. So we are deploying a series of means of pressure to get Maryland Public Television to do that. And the reason is because is everybody familiar with the reparations bill that Westmore vetoed in 2024 or 2025? So if that's a two-party debate and it is Westmore and whatever generic Republican the GOP nominates this time around, that debate is going to be reparations bad versus really I'm doing reparations, right? And that's a terrible debate, right? But if we're up there, we're going to say, we are a party that has believed in reparations for 20 years. We believe that Maryland has to have a policy dedicated to reparations. And we think that Westmore was serving his national interests and not the people of Maryland when he vetoed that bill. And I think that changes the nature of the political conversation in a way that begins to put pressure on people to realize that something different is possible. You know, so I think it's not, I am not of the belief that a healthy party means that we are going to be the next governor and that we're going to take over and there's going to be, you know, some green utopia. That would be nice, but I don't believe in that, right? I believe that we need to use the power that we have in order to change the nature of the debate so that different outcomes are possible and folks like LBS can use that pressure in order to get concessions that they need on other things. It is very much an in the system approach. We are not outside of the system. We are not anarchists. In some ways, we're almost classically liberal. We're trying to use the government in order to change the balance of power so that different people can get different outcomes and that the arrangement of power that exists right now can be realigned so that it is more friendly to racial justice and more friendly to the people of Baltimore.
All right. Dottye.
Well, I cannot add anything to what Andy and Lawrence have talked about because they're totally out. I am totally out of the field to say more than they can say. And I've learned practically everything I would maybe be able to say about them from these two people as well as some other folks. Where I want to kind of start this particular question is kind of back where you started about your own family.
Oh.
And how I think all of us, in one way or another, goes back to that. You know, what was my family teaching me about voting and who to vote for and all those things? My family was a blue-collar family who practically worshiped Franklin Roosevelt and would never have ever thought of voting Republican in any circumstances. Whether they would have thought of voting anybody else if they were alive today, I kind of think they would, because at heart, what they were about was working people. And that's why they were in unions. And that's why my grandfather saw friends of his shot because they were demonstrating as union members and going on strike and things like that. So for me, that whole issue of voting for a third party, and that's all I knew about it, was just the idea of voting for a third party. And that's why the approach that we're hearing about tonight makes such a difference, because it's not about winning the vote. But if we don't start with taking those steps where we can make a difference in the possibility that the space is opened up for a multi-party situation, then we'll always be stuck in that, just circle that goes round and round and never changes anything.
We have a question.
This was really helpful. I've had a very bad day in work that I do, and it feels like the world's on fire. And then this was very kind of concrete and helpful. Can you just give us suggestions, and you don't have to do it now, maybe at the end, or email them out, suggestions of things that we can give to relatives and friends? Because I think there's a big, speaking for folks who really do want to help, friends and family who really do want to help and do this right. I think 2024 was terrifying. And the thought of taking any votes away from not a fascist, nobody was willing to. There were very few people that were willing to do that, and I understood that. And I think that the third party vote was complicated for a lot of folks. There were folks that were struggling with Israel and Palestine. There were folks that were struggling with that they felt there was a lot of anti-Black racism in a lot of third party votes and leaving folks in this country behind. So there's a lot that was in that. But I think that this 2026 is the year to help understand it, because it's not a successful election. So this is helpful. I think some primers for friends and family who are lots of the
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm glad that you said that, because my next kind of question, we discussed this, I think, we were talking about kind of pre-planning this discussion, is I understand this information, right? Or I'm learning this information, and I'm usually in spaces where brilliant, smart, amazing people are able to break this information down for me. But not, when I talk to people in my family, they may not be, they're like, the green party, I'm not doing that. Or I mean, even I think on social media, I've seen a lot of people, there's just so much anger, not at the Democratic Party when they don't do something, but well, had y'all not voted for, this person, for this random person, and where is that person now? If you're not voted for Jill Stein, or, had you, people get Mark Lamont Hill, well, you told people not to vote for Hillary years ago, as opposed to well, did Hillary actually run a good campaign? Did they, did she, was she actually speaking to the people in her party? And that's the same goes for Kamala. Did they actually meet the moment? And so I think part of one of my biggest questions is, how do we have more, I think, substantial conversations about politics? Because part of getting out of the, I think, two-party system is people actually understanding the system we have and the limitations that it actually has, right? So how do we have real, almost I don't want to say the word re-education, that sounds very scary for people. I know. I already, cut that part out, Dana. But no, like, how do we have, I think, more just like intentional, real conversations around what does it mean to actually be a Democrat? What are these words that people are hearing sometimes for the first time? Like, what is an oligarch? You know, some people don't know what neoliberalism is. It's like, and so I think sometimes part of the work is also like, what is that? Where is the education for people to like learn about these things so they can make, you know, real decisions?
So I hear all that. I think trying to maybe take a step back, I think what we want is, in the face of the intensity of the problem, we want a solution that can absolve people's anxieties and function in a way that maybe fits within the something that feels digestible, feels like it could fit in people's minds. And I think to a certain extent, we can't solve the problems of social media with something designed to fit within like a social media algorithm. We can't dissolve people's real material anxieties about their lived experience and material needs with theory. We have to have relationships and continued conversation. And there's also a degree of understanding. Like maybe if you're a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, that may not be the audience for the argument. Similarly, like in 2016, there was a debate in a segment with Eddie Glaude with Mike Eric Dyson. And he was basically saying like, look, we can recognize some people if you're in a swing state, maybe you do vote for Democrats. But if you're in a safe state, either leave the top of the ticket blank or vote green. And that level of political sophistication, I think, makes sense because no, we're talking about races where sometimes there may be Democrats that we're supporting. So it's not like an all or nothing thing. But it's also, again, one of those things where, in the face of the material food insecurity, once again, if 10 years ago we had made a decision to invest in food sovereignty, we're going to keep being in this position unless we have the leverage to mandate certain forms of long-term investments that are not going to happen if we don't have leverage. It is not a sign of care or love to put someone in the position of power of no accountability. You cannot expect them to meet your needs or not be succumb to the pressures if there is no accountability. And I think about this from the perspective of my father being a police officer. Where it's like I have compassion for police when it's like when you have no accountability and you have a gun and you are afraid, you want to come home to your family, it's going to be highly likely you're going to use disproportionate amount of force because you want to come home and you know if you pull that trigger, you can come home. You also know if you pull that trigger, you're probably going to be able to feed your family because the lawyers are going to support you and there's no accountability ecosystem. And that's wrong. And it's not a sign of care to leave someone in that position where they can do real harm with no accountability. In some way, our politicians are similar. They're facing tough decisions, but they can do real harm if there is no accountability. And so it's not a diminution of our care or recognition of our people's need. It's a recognition of our need to say we cannot leave those folks in the position of no accountability. We can't leave our community without leverage to get what we need.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So I think this is a really good question. So part of the reason we are trying to qualify for public financing in the state of Maryland so that we have the kind of resources we need to produce the political education material that we can use to reach people beyond the number of people who are sitting here and listening to this. If we qualify, we'll get $600,000 to $800,000 from the state of Maryland in August of 2026. And that is a material difference that will allow us to hire people to get on the ground in communities across the state and talk to folks, to reach out to people with political education material and things like that so that we can begin to have these conversations. I think that in a state, like so often the national politics galvanize our political imagination to such a degree because it feels like the presidential race and the congressional race have such consequences that everybody focuses on that. And I think that's understandable. But when that happens, in the era since like Newt Gingrich or whatever, that we've had such highly polarized federal politics that no major federal policy making, for the most part, that is really, truly progressive has been able to happen. The states have been the place that have become where all the fights are occurring. So the national parties realized that they were never going to have the kind of majorities at the national level after 1994 that they needed in order to push through big sweeping policy changes. So both national parties started focusing on the states as the vehicle for doing that. And so in most of the states, in many of the states, one party or the other has maintained themselves a supermajority that they allowed themselves to use in order to make their state a laboratory of autocracy, in a sense. There's a guy named Jake Grumbach who writes a book called Laboratories of Autocracy, and he looks at this polarization that is happening in each of the states. And what he finds is that on almost every major policy issue, Democrat supermajority states do one thing, and they all do the same thing. And Republican supermajority states do one thing, and they all do the same thing. The two areas when he wrote this in 2022 that he found that didn't apply to were criminal justice and education. And both Democrats and Republicans in almost every state have tough on crime policies, have tough on gun policies, have shifted heavy sentencing for guns, have done all of these sort of things that we see here in Maryland. They have also both led to the privatization of schools, the hollowing out of teachers' unions, and the austerity budgets for most schools. And I think being able to take it away from the national political theater and ground it in the fact that this neighborhood is over-policed and people is over-policed and under-safe at the same time. And the same people have been in power for a very long time. I know a guy who was in Prince George's County, and he would say, I'm a young Black progressive Democrat, and I call my state legislator or my state senator all the time, and he never responds to me. He never does anything to me. Well, I looked at the district that he was in, and his current state senator was appointed to his House of Delegates seat at one point, and then he never faced a primary challenger. He never faced a general election challenger. And then in the next election, when he was appointed to the state Senate seat, he never faced a primary challenger. He never faced a general election challenger. And so this is a system by design that makes politicians not accountable to people. It is a system that makes it so that they're accountable to national narratives, donors, and party leaders. So when you see Bill Ferguson taking a strong stance this week against redistricting or something like that, he is trying to get the Democrats to be accountable to him because he is interplaying with the national narrative that Wes Moore is also playing with. I think we really need to ground for people that state politics are different. They're different than the national politics. They have control of a lot of important policy issues. And they are so gerrymandered and so they're so gerrymandered so that the politicians don't have to be accountable to the people. There's a reason that most people don't know who their state delegate or their state senator is, even if they know who their congressperson and their mayor is, and often their city council person, because state government, the two parties have made it so that state government is isolated from accountability to the people so that they can run experiments on people in order to try to propagate policies that a future presidential candidate could use. That's what's happening. And I think we need to be able to tell people that and tell people what the consequences are of that so that they understand why that's happening. How do we do it? Some of it is small table conversations like this, getting in rooms like this and talking with people till either they disagree or they understand or whatever. But some of it is also figuring out how to use different kinds of content than other political campaigns use. Third-party campaigns will often try to be like the other two parties, the corporate parties, whose relationship to voters is to get them to volunteer, donate, and vote. That's it. That's all they want from you. They don't want your opinion. They don't want your feedback. They want you to call when they need you to call. They want you to donate when they need you to donate, and they want you to vote when they need you to vote. But third parties have to be associational and work with people in order to build bonds in community so that we understand what Lawrence and LBS need in order to have leverage on a piece of legislation they're working on this year so that we can craft our campaign in a way that helps them to have leverage. We need to understand the people in Western Maryland who are paying 400% increases in their water bills right now because some corporation has taken over and the Public Service Commission is not stopping that. Right? We need to understand how that's happening, why that's happening, and be able to explain to them so that they can explain to their neighbors, because we can't be everywhere at once. And so I think there's a lot of conventional wisdom in politics that has set up a system that is designed to make it so that politicians and political parties are not accountable to people. And we've got to change that. We've got to change it and talk to people until they can understand a way that they can use their power instead of surrendering their power to the parties as they exist right now.
Thank you very much for bringing that in, because it's another situation where my whole life have always focused at the national level. I did work with national organizations in DC. You know, I was always paying attention to the national things. I never knew who my state delegates were, even though I might know the city council and things like that. What got me to understand something about what Andy was just talking about and the importance of it was having my husband in a nursing home during COVID and not being able to see him for 5 months. And I got involved with the state to try to pass a bill saying you have to let family that are okayed by the individual in to see them. People are dying of the isolation, of the confusion for people with dementia about what has happened. I've been abandoned. My family has abandoned me. That was my very first time of paying any attention to the state level, let alone getting involved in it. And I did learn that it's a different world, and it's maybe not as cozy as you might be able to get with your city council member, but you can get into it and you can be asked to testify at committee hearings and at the whole full floor hearings. So pick one thing that you really, really care about, that something is going on in the state, and do that same thing. Get in touch with your delegates, with your senators, get to know them. That's the other thing, you can get to know people who are in the state and in your particular part of the state, and find out how it really works, because it can be very powerful, just like Andy was saying. But as long as we're completely ignorant of how it works, we're not going to be able to do much about it.
Yeah. I saw a hand like raised, so I'm going to go to that person.
BRJA is a project of Public Alliance partnership. It's right down the street from us. White supremacy is alive and well at the school.
Mm-hmm.
And they're right there. They're right there. They're not accountable to the people of this city, of in fact, that were current students. So I want to ask you guys, you are people here all the time. So
It's a good question.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments. If you give me information, I'll definitely follow up, because we are trying to do a project with UMB right now around their research practices and around basically the white supremacy in the way that they do their research. So this is definitely something that we as an institution are trying to figure out. And I think partially some of the things that, I guess I'm trying to weave some things together here. Did you see the press conference they had last week about we're shifting research to make it more private sector oriented? And so I think that's part of what's happening is that in the face of federal budget cuts, like UMB had a whole press conference and they were like, we depended so much on federal grants, the federal money's gone, but who still has the money is the private sector. So we need to teach our researchers to focus more on the private sector, to respond to their needs, to do research that's accountable to them. And I think sometimes, though it's hard to hear, I appreciate it when they make it that clear, right? Where they basically pull the veil back, because they were doing that already, but they had a degree of rhetoric that made it look like they were more interested in social justice than they probably actually were. You know, so it's one of those things where partially those larger political narratives around, oh, we lost 2024 because of woke, we need to get beyond woke, impact people all the way down the line. So even without the federal budget cuts, we know that there's a pullback around the energy around actually committing to the rhetoric around social justice because there's political liability. People would rather not. So we need to build the political pressure to actually show the impact of what happens when you don't invest in this work actually happening. It's not just that representationally people are no longer in the institutions and can no longer give their feedback, but the outcomes that come from actually sharing these perspectives. Like, I keep coming back to it because I think it's so important with the food stamps. Like, if your entire food caloric intake system is dependent upon these federal grants and that money is gone, then if I have a tree in my backyard that has fruit, I can depend on that, right? But just from like a pure objective perspective, it's not about woke, it's not about listening to bodies and spaces of stories. It's just literally, if we have a different model of a theory of solving the problem, we get different outcomes that are less subject to the variability of federal politics. But because we are so invested in these narratives, we can't hear that there are better solutions out there if we had different research methodologies and different understandings of the problem. So I think partially like these are political projects, and we as researchers, we as academics, we have to understand that these are political imperatives that go all the way through our institutions. And, you know, UMB is a state institution. So I think partially, again, it's like applying that pressure at the state level so they can't go with these federal narratives of, well, the funding's cut, so we just gonna do what we're gonna do anyway, right? Maryland's a rich state, got a $50 billion budget. Like, you choose to invest in what you care about, and we need the political pressure to force them to invest.
Yeah, yeah. I'll kind of answer. So, I work at UMB, so I understand exactly what you're saying. And I'll be honest, I think that, for me, these things are hard to struggle with and it's hard to balance. I have very clear-cut views, on what I think and how I want the world to act and be. And I also recognize that like this is where I work. And so therefore, it is a state institution and there are limitations. I think, just come to the, like, this is just what it is. There are limitations, I think, to what state institutions are and what they are going to be. And so that means how I hold myself accountable, is doing work outside of those spaces. I tell students a lot of the time, you know, you do have to make a decision, and I can work and I can push for change in those spaces where I can. But I also do work outside of that space. And that's really important to me. And there might come a time where I'm like, okay, I can no longer deal with this. I can no longer work in this space. But I do think that, you know, especially I think as a social worker, you're not working in perfect spaces. We're never working in spaces that are going to be 100% anything. If anything, they're usually 100% ridiculous and wrapped up in white supremacy and wrapped up in things, that are extremely harmful. But I think part of the work that I continue to have to struggle with and try to move forward in is like, what can I do and when can I do it? So when I'm at work, please believe, I do want you to know, there are people who are in those spaces who understand exactly what you're saying and who are pushing, to make changes. But it's also a state institution. And we need voices, but there's also going to be limits. And I think that that's something that can sound like a cop out, and that's fair. But I think that that's also just like the reality of where we are. And that's something that, like, yeah, every single day I'm like, this sucks. And when I leave here, I'm gonna like go with my BRJA people, or I'm going to work in my community, or I'm gonna work with my college friends who have organizations. Like that's how I have to be holding myself accountable to the work to the beliefs that I hold.
And I would love to talk to you and figure out and hear what your story is. We can either do it tonight, or I can leave you contact information and you can share that with me. I'm happy to hear it. I'm always willing and almost eager to hear people explain the ways that state systems are not working for them. I also recognize it's taken me a long time to do this, but I'm coming to a place where I'm recognizing what I have the power to change and what I don't have the power to change. So there's a very good chance that there's nothing that I will be able to do in the role that I'm in order to be able to address the structural white supremacy of this institution. That being said, I'm happy to hear about it, and I'm not happy to hear about it, and I'm open to hear about it, because that's a fair question. Do you want to hear my story? Yes, I do. I think that for me, there is the sort of important understanding that comes from realizing that we can all do what we can do and that we're in certain lanes at certain times. So if there's a way that after we talk, I can figure out how to use the lane that I'm in right now in order to help change that situation, I will put a ton of energy into trying to figure out how to do that. But if I realize that there's not a meaningful way that I can address that situation, I'll say that to you as well. You know, I think that while we're doing this politics in public, while we're really talking to people, we have to have the humility to say, I don't think that I can address that, or I don't think I can solve that problem. I can talk about it, I can listen about it, but I may not be able to solve it. And I think there is a sort of there's a guy named Olufemi Tewu who writes a book called Reconsidering Reparations. And he makes the argument that taking down the 500-year construction of global racial empire is going to take a very long time. And if it takes half the time that it took to build it to take it down, there is still going to be generations of people who struggle without seeing the outcome that they're looking for, because that struggle is necessary in order to get to the eventual place that we're going to need to be. So he calls this a revolutionary patience. And he says that having the patience to understand that we are not going to be able to solve all of this, we're not going to be able to solve all of the institutions, allows us to listen to people's stories, talk to them, offer what we can, and also recognize that we may not have the power to change this very powerful state institution and its millions of dollars that built this shiny, fancy building. You know, so I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. Please let me know. We can either do it here, or you can send me a message and we can find a time. Share your story with me, and I'll listen.
Nadia, did you want to also answer?
I would definitely like to talk with you. I was going to approach you later and tell you I want to do that very much, because of my explaining that I was there in the beginning when BRJA was formed. I have a lot of really personal concerns about where things can go now. And hearing from, and I'm no longer in the center of the activities of the organization. I'm kind of very much on the border, carrying some history that nobody else who's still around has. But it will always be in my heart the place that I learned so much about myself and about white privilege, and about how just saying you're anti-racist goes nowhere. But being in it wherever you can be in it, and hearing the response of people who are dealing with racism every day in the most direct ways, and not backing off because it feels painful or makes us feel guilty or whatever it is. That's what BRJA has been up against for the whole time. And that this description of the time it took that's kind of what it felt like when I was really engaged in BRJA's work. It's like, I don't see how we're ever going to get anywhere with these white people. My people, it's the problem.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, we're at like 7:15 or so. So one of the things I also just want to say very quickly, and since Dottye is here, I remember when I joined BRJA and I was just like extremely passionate and, you know, s- one of the conversations that I had with someone was essentially just like, well, what's gonna happen when you get like tired? What's gonna happen when you're like, because like that's normal. And I was like, I'm never gonna get tired. Like I'm gonna always do this work. And I mean, like I am tired. Like that was at least that was almost like 10 years ago at this point. Like I am very tired. But I did have to make peace, and I do this daily of like a lot of this work, like you more than likely, you may not be here to see the end result of it. Like, and that's something that is really difficult, I think, sometimes to accept that like you're not gonna, you may not be here like for the results of whatever you're fighting for. But like the work and the struggle of that continues. And so like that's why I think that question of like how do we educate, how do we get more people involved in this to have these kind of conversations, to push and to have these events is so important because if I'm not here, I need somebody else who's going to be able to pick up like the mantle, and who's going to ask different questions, who's going to ask better questions, and who's going to be there when they get tired out. So I think it's also just like remembering that like this has been a very long fight, and I've not always been in the fight, but there were people who were there before me, who I'm picking up the mantle for, and that like that work is just like it just continues hopefully and that's the struggle of it. So we can definitely connect. Like I said, I'm over at UMB, so yeah, we can definitely before I leave today. um I want to, since we're wrapping up, I want to ask, what does a thriving, inclusive, healthy political ecosystem look like for our state and the region in 2026 and beyond? I think that like what we're seeing right now obviously has shaken a lot of people up. I think a lot of people are very much involved or want to be involved and making changes at the state level, at the local level. What does that look like going forward? Or what could that look like?
So 2026 is very close. And I'm not sure, following on the point that we just made about how long it is going to take in order to have some of these wins, that I want to offer an impatient win. But it is very close, and we have an opportunity to use that election in order to build power and systems that can outlast that election and can go forward. And I think if we can do things that make it easier for the next person who wants to challenge unaccountable politicians or to build more just policy, that's good. We have to build institutions in which democracy can be used, in which it can be reinvigorated, in which people can be invited to participate in their own destiny. And that's hard because we live in a system that has made that very difficult and has worked very hard and spent millions and millions of dollars year after year in order to make sure people are not participating in their own destiny. So I think, when we talked about this in 2024, we talked about the movement that came together to beat Question H. Question H was this policy or this, billionaire sponsor, not even a billionaire. Sorry, I forgot my talking point. David Smith is not a billionaire if he's watching. But we put a group of people together that were able to defeat something that hadn't happened in Baltimore in a really long time, and it showed people that that could happen. So for me, what's on the horizon are things like maybe it's time to rewrite the Baltimore City Charter. The Baltimore City Charter is a terrible document that doesn't represent the will of the people. It represents the will of a lot of corporations and a lot of politicians who have been trying to do their own thing. So maybe in 2030, we don't pick at it one thing at a time. We have a grand experiment in democracy where we try to get the people of the city together and talk about what they would need to do in order to be able to have the power to control their own destiny. Now, I'm not naive. I don't think that we do that and all of a sudden we're going to have, some utopian socialist state where everybody gets a say or something like that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't build the institutions necessary in order to move those things forward. So if we have an opportunity to create containers of democracy where people and communities can put pressure on the electeds and those in power, and those things can be durable, we should do that, right? For me, the campaign is one means of doing that. And I hope that after that, it inspires other people, not necessarily Greens. It could be people in the Ujima People's Progress Party. It could be people in the Working Party. It could be people in a as of yet unnamed party that work together in order to allow working class people and Black folks in Baltimore and Black folks across the state to have the power in order to hold their electeds accountable. So, for me, it is this revolutionary patience. We do the small things to build institutions that make it easier so the next time we have this fight, we have more power to do it. And I wish there was an answer that was like, we're going to pass this bill and it will be called the Maryland 2026 Utopia Bill and justice will come and everything will be great. But that is not how the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. It bends because people grab it and pull it and yank on it until it bends toward justice. When it is not bent because people are not pulling on it, that's not the direction it goes. And so I think it is the rest of that quote that doesn't get talked about is that we need to straighten our backs and work for freedom in order to be able to allow those freedom dreams that future generations are going to have to work. And that means making a mark, making a change, building an institution, and doing something that allows us to move forward where more people have more ability to put leverage and power against those in power in order to get the outcomes that they want.
Yeah, along those lines, I want to answer the question, but I also want to include, this is running out of time, stuff about what we're working on in 2026. So I think a thriving democracy looks like people recognizing the points where they can engage. And there are multiple points next year. It's an election year, but all the laws in Maryland are passed in 100 days from January to April. So to engage and put pressure on the lawmakers to deliver in an election year where they're typically more conservative, we have to understand that and respond accordingly. So the first thing they're actually going to take up in January is the veto overrides. So many bills that the governor vetoed, they're actually going to take those up, including the reparations study bill. So the idea is it's not just a study bill, it's studying how to implement and find money for different mechanisms to address the historical harms. So sometimes with study bills, and the governor's been using this talking point, study bill is just kind of a thing you do to say you did something. It doesn't really have concrete impacts. Well, there's so much about what it would take to actually implement a reparations regime. How do you make it pass constitutional muster, knowing that they're going to claim you can't do anything to remediate racism because the Supreme Court will strike it down? We know that's wrong. There are things you can do, like we're doing with the reparations fund here that's based upon cannabis arrests, not race. But they use that talking point to make it like the study bill doesn't matter. So that's apparently one of the first things they're going to take up when session starts. So you want to put pressure on your lawmakers to override the governor's veto on the study bill. Along those lines, part of the argument that people have been making is, well, we don't need to study it, we can just do it. But part of the idea is that they just want to do stuff they were already going to do and call that reparations, right? And to demonstrate the distinction, knowing it's likely not going to pass, one of the things that we're trying to do is to say there are institutions in Maryland with very large endowment, multi-billion-dollar endowments. If you took a small percentage of that endowment, you'd actually have hundreds of millions of dollars you could then use for a reparations type policy. And that's a bill that we're going to advance so that people like Johns Hopkins, people like the Weinberg Foundation and other large foundations actually have to pay, not because of like Trump, they're saying that they're woke and they need to be punished for being woke, but no, they've actually co-opted and harmed the people of the city and the state. And they have to actually use the wealth they have to actually create new investments in new institutions to repair the harm, not the stuff we're already doing and calling it reparations, right? So along those same lines, Andy talked about changing the criteria that Maryland public television uses to determine debates, political parties including debates, but also, again, coming back to youth charges adults, Maryland automatically charges youth as adults for over 30 things and creates an environment where they're put in adult prisons. Oftentimes, because of court rulings, they're basically in solitary confinement because the federal courts say you don't want juveniles in sight or sound of adult prisoners. So you don't want them abused by adults or hardened by adults. But the only place to put them in is basically solitary confinement. And the level of psychological damage and the experiences they get actually mean that if you charge a youth as adult for the same crime compared to a youth charged as a juvenile, the person who goes to adult facilities has more likely to have more severe violent recidivism. So you're actually increasing the risk of public safety, not decreasing it. So then you start them in the juvenile system. For the small percentage of folks that are deemed it's necessary to waive them up, you can put them in an adult facility. But when you start everybody in an adult facility, it basically is so much slower that you put them in adult facilities for extended periods of time, even when the vast majority of them basically get waived back down to the juvenile justice system anyway. So this is really a completely inefficient policy that exists because people don't want the narrative of being soft on crime. And they are recapitulating to youth super predator talking points that they don't want to actually deal with just purely as a pragmatic policy. It's actually very hard to justify. So we've made great progress on that, and we hope to get that across the finish line, but it is an election year. And the last thing is we're actually working on the bill with Delegate Pastor. When you have people who are returning citizens, they have connections to people who are still incarcerated and can be a great source to help those people regratiate into society, but they're often denied access to being able to work behind the walls because the security personnel in those facilities say, well, they could be bringing drugs in, they could be tied to gangs, they could have old beefs that they want to get settled. So they deny access to the people who are oftentimes most effective at helping people transition and re-enter society are returning citizens. So we're actually trying to figure out ways to have legislation so it's no longer set to the whims of the correctional system or individual people running jails, to actually have state legislation to allow returning citizens to work behind bars, to work behind the walls. So you can go to our website, lbsbaltimore.com. We're going to have multiple updates and multiple action alerts asking people to activate to put pressure on folks to deliver in 26.
He doesn't have anything. Okay, well, I think this has been a really informative. Oh, you know what, Andy, you got something else to say?
Yeah. So everything that Lawrence is talking about that they are fighting for is super important, and we hope it passes. We hope that absolutely the legislature passes stopping auto charging youth as adults, right? Like absolutely, everything they're saying should pass. And but I think the importance of the piece of debate legislation that they're talking about and that we were working on is that if it doesn't pass, right now, in the formulation that they have, they will not be held accountable for that. Democrats will not be held accountable for not stopping charging youth as adults in the current situation that we have. And the importance of the debate bill that they're going to be sponsoring and that we're going to be working on is that if we get on that debate stage, we're going to hold them accountable for that, right? We're going to be on television and we're going to say, why didn't you put pressure to make this happen? Why are you continuing to support Israel? Why did you veto the reparations bill? Why? Those questions need to get asked. And that's why the debate bill that they're working on is part of the rest of the legislative package, because it creates an avenue for accountability for elected officials that otherwise wouldn't have it. And I think that's the type of place where we can work together on these type of things, where we know what they need and our campaign can help them to get the leverage that they need about that, while also working to advance the idea of multi-party politics in Maryland.
So this was like a lot of information, and I want to thank Dottye, Andy, and Lawrence for just like taking the time this evening and having this conversation. I don't have any legislation for 2026, but I will say, as dire as things are and as they feel, I think it is really, really important for people to use this as an opportunity to really kind of dig into their communities. That is easier said than done, but coming to events like these obviously, and also like promoting and sharing these events, but also finding ways to get involved. So that's joining BRJA, if that's joining your community groups, if that's going to, to talk at events. I think that this is an opportunity to also become like educated and to really start to meet people to make moves happen. Because sometimes I think the work is people want to be out in the streets and that's part of it, but like we still need people who are educating, people who are feeding each other, people who are growing food, people who are volunteering, and all that is all needed still in these moments of just confusion and fear. So just using this opportunity to also lean in and to also look up what these folks are talking about in the organization so you all can get to work.